The most dangerous prison ever constructed is one whose bars are forged from your own happiest memories. A panopticon where the inmate and the warden share the same trembling hand. Highlight reel syndrome operates on this precise architectural malice, colonizing the psyche not through overt trauma, but through the insidious curation of peak experiences, effectively severing the individual from the vast, textured landscape of their own lived reality. The mind, desperate for narrative coherence, begins to treat the unedited footage of existence, the long commutes, the silent meals, the creeping hours of ambient anxiety, as a corrupted file. A glitch in the system that must be quarantined to preserve the sanctity of the curated montage. This is not mere nostalgia. It is a hostile takeover of the present tense by a highly edited past, a temporal imperialism where the dopamine spikes of yesterday become the suffocating smog of tomorrow, rendering the unremarkable now as a pale, unsatisfying shadow play against the technicolor brilliance of what has already been. The brain, that lazy cartographer, redraws the map of the self, shrinking the continents of mundane survival to make room for the towering neon-lit monuments of past triumphs, until the individual wanders the shrunken corridors of their current life, feeling perpetually evicted from their own history. The neurological architecture of this phenomenon reveals a terrifying vulnerability in the human reward system, where the anticipation of an event consistently outpaces the experience of it, creating a permanent state of existential debt. Highlight reel syndrome exploits this biological loophole by transforming memory from a passive archive into an active, predatory algorithm that continuously mines the past for the purest veins of unblemished joy, refining them into a potent, intoxicating concentrate that makes the diluted waters of the present taste like ash. We become junkies for our own mythology, chasing the phantom limb of a feeling that the original event never actually contained, because the highlight reel is not a record of what happened, but a prophecy of a satisfaction that was chemically impossible to achieve in real time. The mind, in its ruthless pursuit of efficiency, discards the connective tissue of experience, the boredom, the friction, the quiet confusion, and leaves only the polished bone structure of the event, a skeletal framework upon which the ego can drape its most flattering garments. This creates a terrifying asymmetry in the psyche, where the internal audience demands that reality perform at the cinematic standards of its own edited biography, and reality, stubbornly analog and uncooperative, inevitably fails the audition. The existential weight of this syndrome manifests as a profound ambient grief for a life that was never actually lived, a mourning process for the three-dimensional reality that was sacrificed upon the altar of the two-dimensional projection. The individual suffering from highlight reel syndrome is trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every reflection is a distorted, idealized caricature, and the actual, breathing self is perceived as a flawed understudy, perpetually failing to hit the marks set by a ghost. This creates a schism in the temporal self, a civil war between the archived avatar and the breathing entity, where the avatar, unburdened by the friction of time and the decay of context, remains forever young, forever victorious, and forever out of reach. The present moment is no longer a space of becoming, but a site of constant, agonizing comparison, a courtroom where the current self is perpetually on trial for the crime of not being the past self. The tragedy lies in the realization that the highlight reel is not a sanctuary, but a quarantine zone, designed to protect the ego from the terrifying ambiguity of the unedited truth, which is that most of life is a quiet, unremarkable negotiation with entropy, punctuated by brief, chaotic flashes of meaning that only make sense in the context of the surrounding silence. The cultural scaffolding of the modern era acts as a massive accelerant to this psychological condition, weaponizing the architecture of social media to transform the private, internal highlight reel into a public, competitive commodity. We are no longer merely the directors of our own internal montages. We are the producers of a global broadcast, forced to curate our existence into a marketable aesthetic that can compete with the airbrushed mythologies of millions of other isolated consciousnesses. This digital panopticon creates a feedback loop of escalating unreality, where the pressure to produce highlights forces individuals to engineer their lives for the camera, prioritizing the visual syntax of joy over the messy, unphotogenic substance of it. The algorithm, that cold, unfeeling arbiter of attention, rewards the peak, the climax, the perfectly lit epiphany, while ignoring the slow, organic growth that happens in the dark, in the quiet, in the spaces between the posts. The result is a collective descent into a shared hallucination, a global consensus that life is a series of breathtaking vistas, when in truth, it is mostly a trudge through the mud, carrying the heavy, invisible weight of our own expectations. The screen becomes a membrane that separates the curated self from the authentic self, and the longer one presses against that membrane, the more the authentic self atrophies, turning into a pale, ghostly appendage that only exists to serve the narrative of the avatar. The most insidious aspect of highlight reel syndrome is its ability to retroactively colonize the past, rewriting the emotional script of memories that were originally experienced as ambiguous, painful, or simply neutral. The mind, in its desperate quest for a coherent narrative, applies a filter of retrospective triumph to events that were originally characterized by confusion or defeat, effectively gaslighting the individual out of their own history. A period of intense struggle is reframed as a heroic origin story. A relationship defined by quiet incompatibility is edited into a sweeping, tragic romance. A job that was merely a means of survival is mythologized as a passionate calling. This retroactive curation is a form of psychological taxidermy, where the wild, breathing chaos of the past is killed, stuffed, and posed in a position that flatters the present ego. The individual becomes a stranger to their own timeline, unable to access the raw, unprocessed data of their former life, trapped in a museum of their own making, surrounded by wax figures that bear only a superficial resemblance to the people they used to be. The horror of this realization is not that the past was bad, but that the past is no longer true, having been overwritten by a fiction that serves the psychological needs of the present moment. To break free from the gravitational pull of the highlight reel requires a radical, almost violent reorientation of consciousness, a deliberate descent into the unedited footage of existence that the ego has worked so hard to suppress. It demands a willingness to sit with the long, uneventful takes, the scenes of awkward transition, the moments of profound boredom and quiet desperation that form the actual structural foundation of a human life. This is not a call for despair, but for a profound, almost monastic acceptance of the mundane as the true medium of existence, the soil from which the rare, fleeting flowers of joy actually grow. The unedited life is a terrifying prospect for an ego addicted to the dopamine of the climax, because it reveals that the climax was never the point. The point was the slow, agonizing, beautiful accumulation of time that surrounded it. To embrace the unedited real is to accept that the vast majority of one's existence will never be witnessed, never be validated, never be transformed into a shareable aesthetic, and that this invisibility is not a tragedy, but the fundamental, sacred condition of being alive. The architecture of the self must be rebuilt from the ground up, not as a monument to the peaks, but as a sprawling, messy, unremarkable city, where the infrastructure of the everyday is celebrated as the true miracle of human endurance. The ultimate, terrifying paradox of highlight reel syndrome is that the very act of curating our joy is the mechanism by which we destroy our capacity to experience it, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of emptiness that can only be resolved by surrendering the camera entirely. The highlight reel is a monument to the fear of death, a desperate attempt to freeze the fleeting moments of light before the inevitable darkness swallows them whole. But in doing so, it creates a darkness of its own, a shadowland of comparison and inadequacy that renders the present moment uninhabitable. We become so obsessed with capturing the sunset that we forget to feel the warmth of the sun on our skin, so focused on framing the perfect shot of the wave that we forget the shock of the cold water. The camera, whether literal or metaphorical, inserts a pane of glass between the observer and the observed, transforming lived experience into a spectacle and the observer into a passive consumer of their own life. To drop the camera is to shatter that glass, to allow the raw, unfiltered chaos of reality to rush in, bringing with it the risk of pain, the certainty of boredom, and the profound, unspeakable beauty of a moment that will never be repeated, never be remembered, and never be anything other than what it is. The existential dread that accompanies this realization is the final, necessary death of the ego, the moment when the curator realizes that the museum was a prison, and the only way to escape is to burn the archives and walk out into the blinding, unedited light of the ordinary day.